Guy Caruso. I'm part of the Energy and National Security team here at the CSIS, and really appreciate everyone being here to discuss this very topical top discussion that we've had this morning on the upstream. And I was struck by a very different perspective between the two panels, like the upstream experts, from the geological and petroleum engineering perspective, and then the financial. I thought that there was quite a contrast, especially when it came to the differences in price impact on the finances versus the geology. And so we're very fortunate to be able to continue that discussion this afternoon with Velo Kuskra, who is the president of Advanced Resources International here, headquartered here in the Northern Virginia area. So we've been lucky to have had a long association with Velo, and in my time at the Department of Energy, and then we're both active in the international and the U.S. associations of energy economics, and we've both been doing it for, we'll just say, more than 40 years.
Too long.
And Velo and I have a pact. We're both going to keep doing it till we get it right. And as you heard from Adam and in fact in Bob Kleinberg's slide, you know, how the projections are so difficult, and both at my time at EIA, and then Paul Sankey and I worked together at the IEA, and we're doing a little bit involved with the forecasting. I didn't know, Paul, until today that you were making up all those numbers about energy demand in Africa, but it's never too late to make. Oh, here he is. So, as one side anecdotal story about Bakken. When I was at the administrator of EIA, I had a visit from David Bardeen, who was one of the original leaders in what then was Federal Energy Administration, then became DOE. And it was 2005, and he came to see me and he said, "Have you ever heard of Bakken?" And I thought he was, you know, my first thought was, what, does he want to talk to me about a throat disease? And it turned out that, you know, we really knew very little about shale oil and shale gas at that time. And we've seen from the discussion this morning and the projections how recent this phenomenon has changed, and how, yes, maybe a lot of us were wrong, but I think we've learned a lot, and I was very impressed with the learning curve that was demonstrated both on the upstream side and on the financial side. And after I left EIA, and the shale oil and gas were such an important part of the projections, we were very fortunate to have asked Velo and his team at ARI to look at what are the implications of what's happening in North America for the rest of the world. And Velo and his team did an outstanding job. I think that was a 2011 study that was first, yeah, and then a big one in 13, and then another in 2013. And we've asked Velo today to take a look at that very topic. What is the experience that we've heard about, and he will elaborate more on it in the U.S. on unconventional oil and gas for the rest of the world. And so we're going to really be informed, I think, very soon about that from Velo. And I want to, first of all, thank you very much for all of the work we've done together and continued here in your presentations at CSIS. look forward to hearing from you today. Velo, thanks again for coming.
So a couple weeks ago, I got a phone call, and it was Frank on the phone, and I could tell there was some anxiety in his voice, and he said, how would you like to give our luncheon talk? And I stopped for a minute and said, what? Your preferred speaker kind of canceled out? And he said, well, it's actually more drastic than that. I've called a dozen people, and they're either out of town or they're too busy and whatever, and you're my last hope. I'm really desperate, and it's either you give this talk or I'm going to show reruns of Mr. Rogers' It's a Wonderful Neighborhood slides. And not only that, but he had his muscle, Adam, on the line, and I wasn't going to tangle with Adam. And Frank had set the bar quite low, and so I agreed. And so I'm going to leave it up to you at the end of this to decide, would you have actually rather seen the reruns of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? Well, we'll do a survey at the end. Okay. What I'd like to do is to, whoops, let me go forward. Yes. What I'd like to do is first say who we are. Some of you know us, some of you don't. We've been around since the early days of some of the issues around oil and gas in town. But we're primarily a geology and engineering firm, and then we do other things like enhanced oil recovery, which has some application, I think, here as well. And we also do, on the side, projections and forecasts and all of those things. And those are some of our clients that are up there. So what I'd like to do today is to start out with the U.S. and kind of do a little bit of historical look, see what implications we might be able to draw from there to basically the shale oil, the tight oil developments worldwide. So, production, this is probably one of the, I think it is the fastest growing resource. And I've seen people compare this to the North Sea or Alaska or other settings. It climbed from about 1 million barrels a day in 2011 to nearly 5 million barrels a day basically in 2015. Then came the price collapse, which of course shale oil helped bring about, and a steep drop in rigs and wells, and growth came to a halt and actually declined in 2016. And there were expectations by some, and I guess I could even say by many, that lower oil prices would basically crush the development of tight oil, a resource that had prospered, obviously, under $100 barrel oil prices. However, tight oil production rebounded to a new record of 5 million barrels a day on average in 2017, exited the year at 5.5 million barrels, even as oil prices remained around $50 for most of the year, climbed some toward the end of the year. And this basically prompted 3 questions. One is, what is it that has enabled tight oil production to rebound and surge during a time of lower oil prices? I think in general, both from this morning's session, but from your own readings, you've got a general idea of that. What I want to do is put some quantitative rigor to that question. And then second, looking somewhat forward, with higher oilfield service costs on the horizon, operators' use of more intensive development practice and costly development practices, is growth of tight oil sustainable? And then how might these learnings from the U.S. And North America have applicability for global tight oil development? So I want to take a historical look at what enabled tight oil production to surge. And broadly speaking, it's the advanced well D&C technology. You heard about those this morning. They led to stronger well performance, along with improved operating efficiencies. And then as oil prices collapsed, service costs collapsed with it. And these are the main factors that enabled tight oil to remain economic in this lower priced world. And to support this, we took 5 plays, one from each of the major tight oil basins, the Permian, Permian Midland and Delaware, Eagle Ford, Williston, and the DJ Basin. We basically went back and looked at the type curves that we had for these plays, looked at how progress had taken place in these, and then compared that with 2017. So let me start with the first of these, and that is well performance. Now, I've picked 5 plays that are really in the core of the basin. Not necessarily the very best, but each of these are clearly in the top quartile. So don't think that this represents the average for the basin, but it's also the plays that are being most actively developed and have been underway the longest amount of time. And if we go back to 2013 and 2014, what you see is, and what we tried to do is to quantify the 3 big factors. There are others beyond this that influence well performance. The length of the lateral, the number of frac stages that you're using, and then the volume of proppant that you're using on a pounds per foot basis. And then link that to the EUR in thousands of barrels of oil equivalent. And then compare that to what's taking place in 2017. And what you can see is the lateral lengths have gone up. In some basins, not like the Eagle Ford, not all that much. However, Eagle Ford chose to double its proppant loadings and add frac stages. So, and then some like the Bakken that had already had very long laterals, they didn't have that much more opportunity, but they did other things to improve performance. And so what you see is that, a little too quick. The change in well performance for a new play like the Delaware Basin Wolfcamp, basically 2 to 3-fold improvement in performance. A lot of that was, in addition, things they did. It was learning and then narrowing down on really the higher quality portion of the play. You see the second one that was quite emerging, the Niobrara Shale, about a 70% improvement in well performance, a lot more natural gas and wet gas. And then, 13, 17, 38% types of improvement. And what I wanted to do then was to link this improvement to the change, both along with well drilling and completion costs, to look at what the break-evens were. So we go back to 2013, 2014, and we see, the great Midland Basin Wolfcamp already in the mid-50s, but other plays. The early development of the Delaware or the Eagle Ford Shale, with break-even costs that were in the $70 and $80 type of a range. And this is what was behind the view that, all right, these things did very well at $80 to $100 oil prices. If prices go down to 50, this industry will die. Well, it didn't. And what we see is basically with the improvements in well performance, as well as the lower well drilling and completion costs, not in all basins, because some basins like the Delaware Basin Wolfcamp actually spent more money on longer laterals, proppant, et cetera, but they got tremendous improvements in well performance. And others, like the Bakken, it was relatively modest improvement in well performance, but they brought their costs down. So here, basically, the cost came down to low 40s to high 40s. And under a $50 oil price, those are economic. Now, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about break-even costs, because that was a question that was asked. And when I talk about break-even costs, it's full cycle costs. It includes land, it includes corporate overheads, it includes mechanical failures, dry holes, the front-end G&G, and it includes a 15% return on capital. This is basically what the company needs to have that particular play be economic and compete for capital. It's not a wellhead break-even. I think those are misleading types of numbers. They help in terms of making certain decisions, but they're not a measure of break-even or profitability. So, having taken a historical look, we wanted to also take a look forward. And with the rebound and rig utilizations, well drilling, oil service companies have begun to increase rig day rates, frac costs, and also the use of these more intensive practices, such as longer laterals, more fracs, higher volume proppant, will raise well D&C costs. In contrast, however, fortunately, improving efficiencies in days to drill a well, greater use of lower cost sand, brown sand instead of white sand, and more competitive procurement of services will continue to help hold down these costs, as will the improvements in well performance that would derive from these practices. So the question then becomes, how will this combination of increased oil field service costs, more intensive development practices, and improving well productivities drive future, let's say year 2025, tight oil break-even costs? And so we went back to looking at these 5 plays, and these are one play or a set of 5 plays taken from a larger set of 85 plays that really define our tight oil resource base itself. And so now, actually, it was a question, I think, Tom, that you asked. Well, if you go back and projected how your wells would perform, how have they actually done that? Well, let's get together in 2025 and we'll see how we did. So what we have is we go through each of these plays and look where they are, and then look where some of the leading companies in that play, in terms of what are they doing, and then in our view, how should this play be developed as it's getting closer to its optimum practices. So we would adjust the lateral length, we would add stages, we would increase proppant volumes as we thought they were appropriate, and from that we develop a new type curve laying out the expectations for, whoops, did I go? There, now you're caught up, sorry. I won't go back to the discussion. So what we did was to basically project what we would expect in terms of well performance in the year 2025. And what you see is a new play, the Anadarko Merrimack. It's early stages. We'd expect substantial growth in well performance, 25%. And some of the more mature plays, particularly Eagle Ford Shale and the Karnes Trough, that EOG has really pushed pretty much to its limit, relatively modest improvement in well performance. And I want to talk about the Eagle Ford Shale a little more because I'm going to use that as a more detailed example, but I also want to use this. You've heard some critique that the tight oil resources aren't being properly analyzed because people aren't taking into account spatial variation. I think that was at the heart of a paper from MIT, and they did a statistical look at this topic. Our view is that you really need to take a geological view of the spatial distributions. If something like the Eagle Ford Shale, you start out on the north side with basically light and volatile oil. You go through the middle part of the basin, through the condensate window, and you go to the south, you end up with dry gas. So there are numerous hydrocarbon windows, and the geological, let's say, quality of this play also ranges from basically east to west. And so to really get a handle on the Eagle Ford, it's useful to really carve it up into its, let's call, geologically consistent partitions. And so we're looking at one of these partitions, and that's, as I mentioned, that's way over there if you see 4E, and that's the famous EOG's Carnes Trough. Let me jump back one. Okay. So in addition to looking ahead in terms of how might wells perform, we also laid out what we think these wells will cost. And I'm making the assumption that in 2025, we're basically at $65 a barrel type of a world. And our models link cost to prices, so you don't really get a free ride, a total free ride. And then we laid out some more detailed expectations. Those of you who heard BP talk yesterday about their expectations, they said they would expect a 40% improvement in drilling efficiencies between now and the next 10 years. We have roughly, if you look at the days to drill up there, that's about a 30% improvement in well drilling efficiencies in 8 years. So we're roughly in the same ballpark. We do expect rig day rates to go up with increased activity. We also expect more frac stages, and those cost more, and the frac fleets themselves will be more costly going in the future. So what you see is a well that last year it cost about $6 million to drill, now goes to 7.2. However, well performance improves, and you can see in the circled area, even though overall costs have gone up by 21%, break-even costs have really gone up roughly about $3 a barrel, less than 10%. So I wanted to take that and then apply it to the other four, just to kind of show the diversity of things that could be taking place, that we view would take place. So something like the Midland Basin Wolfcamp stays about the same in terms of break-even costs, even though well costs go up considerably. The Merrimack goes up slightly, as does the Eagle Ford. And you come to the Bakken, and the Bakken is now a much more mature play. There aren't the same kind of opportunities for improving well performance, and its break-even costs go up into the high 50s for this particular play. In contrast, the Niobrara Shale, which is a new emerging play, has lots of wet gas, and we do expect a stronger NGL market by 2025. It actually comes down in terms of cost, and of these plays becomes the lowest cost option. And I'm sure Noble and Chesapeake and a few other companies would be very happy with that if that's how it turns out. So this is kind of my quick walk through history, what happened, and what implications might this continued technological evolution and better practices have going forward. Because I want to then relate that to where we are now and where could we be in terms of global tight oil development. So that's my transition slide. And so this is the study that we did back in 2013, sponsored by the US EIA. It was a way I like to call it, it's a labor of love. It was over 700 pages, 137 formations, 95 basins, 41 countries. And recently we added 4 more countries, Chad, Kazakhstan, Oman, and UAE. And now recall that this was, when we did it when we started on it, kind of in 2011, 2012, it was shale gas. That was the thing, and in fact, the title is actually World Shale Gas and Shale Oil Resources. And oil kind of came along for the ride because there were many parts of these basins that basically were in the oil window. And so we had to carve them out, and we had to put some numbers to them, et cetera. And we did that. Since then, we've learned a lot. And we've worked both up in Canada and Colombia, and of course in the US. And now our numbers for at least the US resources are up about 3-fold. Not all of that is high quality. Not all of that would be developed at our expectations of prices. In fact, large portions of it would not and would await improved technologies. So let me walk through some of these. I think, let me start with our neighbor to the north. You can't really talk about Canada's tight gas, shale oil or shale gas without talking about the mighty Montney. It's one of these massively stacked plays, very much like our Permian Basin itself. A lot of activities going on there, both there as well as Duvernay. And basically, it's already underway. It's still mostly a gas play, but it provides about 300,000 barrels a day of tight oil and 100,000 barrels a day of condensate. And we look for each of those to grow by about 100,000 barrels from these 2 plays. In addition, and this is, I think, I particularly wanted to pick this slide to show the parallel that Canada has with the US. And this is now a kind of rediscovery of an old deep basin play. This is true tight oil. It's not shale. It's tight sandstones and carbonates. But what you see is, the same kind of improvements in days to drill a well. The average drilling costs are cut in half. And then you see this 47% improvement in well performance in the last 5 years. So that same story that we saw in the US is being carried out in Canada. Let me turn now to an area that we like particularly. We had a chance to visit there with IEA and exchange some ideas, and that's Argentina. It has a large, geologically favorable 27 billion barrels of risked, technically recoverable shale oil resource, and it's really the next logical location for tight oil. Production, gross production, has been growing steadily, primarily from the YPF and the Chevron joint venture in the Neuquén Basin in the Vaca Muerta Shale. There are other plays going elsewhere. They're somewhat earlier in their life. And there are strong expectations here just for YPF itself, and they probably account for more than half of the country's production, to grow basically a combination of tight oil, tight gas, shale oil to about 700,000 barrels BOE per day in the next 5 years. Now, is that possible? Is it likely? Well, they've done 2 things. One is they've worked rigorously, and in fact, that was the theme that we heard from the YPF presentations when we went to Buenos Aires. We want to get the next rounds of technologies, and I get to apply them, and they've done that. From beginning of 2016 to toward the end of 17, they've increased their lateral lengths, the number of frac stages, and brought down their costs basically by about 35%. They brought down these costs heavily by bringing in their own rig fleet and basically having a very modern fleet that they could incentivize to drill efficiently for them. They've worked on improving the well performances, but they've also, and very importantly, following our earlier panel here, they're planning to invest, this is YPF, along with its JV partners, $15 billion in the next 5 years in the Vaca Muerta Shale. So in our view, with this kind of investment, with these types of improvements in performance at lower costs, we think those kind of expectations are quite reasonable for Argentina. Let me move to Russia. And when we when we did the study in Russia, we looked primarily at shale oil and heavily at the Bazhinov Shale of Western Siberia. That is the big dog, but it has other, Russia has other shale, world scale shale and tight oil, what's called hard to recover oil from formations like Akimov and Toyman. They have next door to the Bazhinov, they have the Timan Pechora, and then to the south, the Domanik Shale. Let's call it Domanik tight oil would be, because it's actually a carbonate in the Volga-Urals. And once activity gets here, I wouldn't be surprised if Russia moves back to the top of the list in terms of tight oil resources. Now, unknown to many, Russia actually already produces large volumes of tight oil. Not shale oil, but let's call it hard to recover oil, where you have to use mostly horizontal wells, hydraulic fracturing, and that total in early 2017 was 1.3 million barrels a day. In addition, Gazprom's program in the Bazhinov has been made a national project. And it's expected to contribute around 400,000 barrels a day by 2030. So this provides a little slice of where Russia's oil production could come from. And it's really all based on pushing technologies. They have a goal of getting to 2 million barrels a day. That includes what they currently produce, what's going to come from the Bazhinov and others. And there is what I would call a first-rate research effort, exploration research effort between Statoil and Rosneft, taking place basically in the Domanik tight oil limestone play. And they did really the first, what I would call truly modern, horizontal, multi-stage, optimized well, and this joint venture plans to do 3 more of those to push the technical limits. Gazprom has a research effort underway, a drilling research effort underway, and it has basically brought down the costs of drilling complex horizontal wells by almost half since 2011. And this was a surprise to me. When I last looked at them, I knew they had only drilled like 10% horizontals. They're up to 40% of their wells are now horizontals, and Gazprom by itself produces about half of the tight oil or hard to recover oil in Russia. Let me move on to China. Again, China has large 32 million, that should be 32 billion barrels, if you would, and I'll correct that, technically recoverable shale oil resource, but it's made its priority so far on going after shale gas, primarily in the Sichuan Basin, and to their credit, they've succeeded. They're basically reached 1 billion cubic feet a day in 2017, and they expect to get to, I believe it's 3 billion cubic feet a day by 2025, and then basically triple that again in the next 15 years. However, there is tight oil pursuit going on in the Ordos Basin, Shangqing Field. This oil is in ultra-low permeability shales and low permeability tight sandstones. It's a very large resource, about 22 billion barrels itself. It's not something that we've independently appraised, and it contributes a modest portion of the 500,000 barrels of oil that's coming from this field. I don't have the exact number. I would guess it's somewhere in the order of around 5 to 10% of that production. China's other shale oil basins, Tarim, Yungar, Sangliao, Ordos, are geologically challenging. They have high clay contents, difficulty to hydraulic fracture, and somewhere, if there's a breakthrough in being able to really break apart these clay-rich deposits, China has tremendous potential for adding tight oil. So my last country is Colombia. Approximately 8 billion barrels. It kind of pales compared to these other numbers I've shown up, but for Colombia, it's quite significant. And after many years of kind of testing, Ecopetrol announced in middle of 2017 that shale oil is going to be a company's strategic focus. And the way they want to pursue it is to seek partners with technical know-how. So, we believe there's some opportunities here to bring Western technology to the game. ConocoPhillips is there already, and they drilled this, what I would again call the first-of-a-kind exploration well in the La Luna Shale, a very rich, very high-quality shale. And they're going to do that with a massively stimulated horizontal well next year. Their goals, depending again on what they expect for oil price, to reach 200 to 400,000 barrels a day of tight oil production in 10 to 15 years. Recall they currently now produce at a little over 800,000 barrels a day, so that would be a nice augment. But the well costs are still high, and there's a lot of local opposition to development itself. So with that, let me give you some closing thoughts. First, in terms of domestic technology progress, it's really been the learnings and the advanced field development that have dramatically lowered domestic tight oil break-even costs, enabling this resource to prosper during lower oil prices. In terms of sustainability, we think with continued optimization of development practices, this resource will not only remain sustainable, but will reach, in our view, 10 million barrels a day within a decade and remain at this plateau for well over a decade before entering decline. In terms of global tight oil production, once you bring in basically the tight oil in addition to shale oil and the hard-to-recover oil, it already provides significant volumes of production in Canada, Argentina, Russia, China, Colombia, with potential in many other countries. And then finally, it all comes down to continuation of technology progress. While each of these plays has its unique challenges, basically, we believe the gains that we've seen in the US and Canada and now in Argentina are achievable, but are also essential for economically viable global tight oil development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vello. And You want to answer questions from
Sure.
up there?
Can I come down here?
Yeah.
Good.
More comfortable. And one general question, one specific. You know, whenever we're talking to groups, especially who aren't experts, and ask, well, why can't there be a replication of this? Or why haven't, I guess a better question is, why haven't we seen more progress in the countries that you just enumerated, as well as the others that were in your report? And I've been given the answer, well, it's not really the same homogeneity of the geology, water accessibility, and infrastructure availability as my sort of not an economist trying to answer a question that's more upstream centric. Are those what's held back?
There's
some
more
of these
than
plays?
that. Now, I think it's important to recognize that this overnight phenomena of shale gas and shale oil actually had its roots in 1980. This was when the Department of Energy started its unconventional gas program, which basically focused in on kind of understanding these resources. And then it was followed up by the Gas Research Institute, who took that scientific knowledge into the field and began to test and fail and try other things as well. So we've been at this for over 30 years. So it's not surprising that these other countries also need, who started basically from scratch like we did, to take some time to gain this understanding itself. So that's part of it. The second is a point you make, Guy, is that each of these basins has its own challenges. And you can't just basically take the same practice and bring it over without modification and be successful. There are different stress regimes, there are different depositional environments, and this technology needs to be adapted over, and you need to have the internal capability, whether you bring it in from the outside or preferably internal, to make those adaptations, and then be also willing to take the risks and the failures that go with the early movers themselves. We were really fortunate. Industry stepped in, came along for basically with the funding that was provided from outside, from R&D operations, and learned as part of that. And so, and now, of course, with this tremendous momentum underway, now it's, in the U.S., it's mostly optimization.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point about the timing factor. One of the first speakers we ever had here at CSIS was from Halliburton. He was a fairly senior petroleum engineer. He said he had been working on the trying to crack this code for 30 years. That's and right. He said, well, we now have a 30-year overnight success.
Exactly. That's so well put.
My specific point is, question is on the Bazanov Russian shale facility or deposit. Is are the current sanctions that are levied on Russia in any way holding back the development, or might they in the future?
Right now, interesting the way that the sanctions are written. Western companies cannot work in the Bazanov, but they can work in the demonic tight oil play. And the technology is essentially the same. So because of sanctions, Gazprom itself has decided to learn and develop these technologies. It'll take a little longer, but in the long term, it probably is to their benefit. They build that internal capability to do these. And then there will be the need, of course, for capital, et cetera. The biggest challenge had been to properly hydraulically stimulate this shale, and they were looking for pockets of natural fractures where the well would produce 1,000, 1,500 barrels a day, but they're far widely dispersed and hard to find And so they've worked very hard on improving their horizontal drilling technology and stimulation technology.
Well, I think we have time for questions. So I immediately see Alulu and then Bob Kleinberg. So start with you, Alulu.
My name is Alulu, Fawzi Alulu from EIA. Velo, I remember I was the project manager of the labor of love 700 pages. So I know the periods and the dots and the tables, and it was great working with you. When we released it in 2011, it was shale gas, world shale gas. And the shock and awe when we released it at EIA, it's about Poland. So I didn't see you here mentioning anything about Poland. So I would like to see your assessment on that. And also it was China more than US at that time. Then when we released 2013 report, we are discovering or telling the idea about Russia, Mexico, and here in Mexico you didn't mention anything, even though they are undertaking some reforms, and there are some industry have some interest about Tampico and Burgos.
Could you repeat that again? It was a little hard to hear.
Why you mentioned Poland or Mexico in your presentation?
Well, Poland is primarily shale gas. It's a gas type of play. It's, again, a challenging geological setting. The Carpathians have squeezed those basins. And there's some, and then to the north, there are questions about thermal maturity there. And so that's discussed in the report itself. What was the other country? Oh, Mexico. Mexico, I think, has substantial both tight oil and shale gas potential. So far, however, they have not been able to bring the costs of developing that down to be competitive with importing gas from across the border from the Eagle Ford or the Permian itself. And so they have some work to do to bring those and make them competitive with other sources.
Yeah, Bob Kleinberg from Schlumberger. Very admirably careful analyses, Velo, so very nice. I have two comments. One is on the Statoil participation in the Dominique in Russia. I've always felt that Statoil had sort of slipped in through a loophole due to the incorrect definition of what tight oil is. And I think just in the interest of good governance, that should be cleaned up, and the definition from BIS be made more technical and more specific. Second point is when you compared the break-evens for 2013 and 2017, you specify that both are full cycle break-even.
Yes.
Which is an apples-to-apples comparison. But what I would argue is that the full cycle break-even was appropriate in 2013, but half cycle break-even more appropriate in 2017 because you already had all the property explored, leased up, de-risked, and they were just drilling really in sweet spots.
Yeah.
So just a comment on that, and as you know, I've recently published a paper on that very subject, so I'm certainly happy to talk to you about it.
Sure. Well, what we do is, if we take land costs, for example, and they have been acquired, we allocate that to the well, and then wait for the other wells to be drilled to make that allocation. So it's really designed to, we're trying not to give any free rides or overly cost the front end. The same way on facilities, you basically allocate the costs of operating those facilities to both the new wells as well as the existing wells itself. I'll make some allowance for using half-cycle costs for making drilling decisions, but they're not, that's the difference between having profitable drilling sites and losing money at the corporate level.
Jesse?
Thanks. Tim Gould from IA. Thanks very much, Velo. Always good to hear from you. I had a question on China, because we hear a lot about the Sinopec fooling development, and there is some opinion that that is atypical for Sichuan. So I wanted to get your view on, I mean, that's clearly a very successful operation. To what extent do you think that that is a sign of things potentially to come in the Sichuan Basin? Or do you think that, that it is and will remain something of a one-off in the discussion on the China outlook, which is certainly for us, China shale is one of the huge uncertainties over the gas balance over the longer term.
Okay, just to repeat the question is, you're asking about China's shale development. Yeah. We have not yet developed technology that can work in, we have technology that works in brittle formations, but not in formations that are clay-rich and respond in a plastic kind of way. There a little bit of success in Australia in going after these kinds of shales, very episodic so far. And even in the Ordos where they're working, that's again a very lenticular, non-marine type of deposition, and those are challenging, and that's why they focused primarily on, of course, on the Sichuan shale gas, because that has the right kind of geologic properties to be successful. And you know, I think probably one of the great international ventures would be to undertake the technology efforts to develop stimulation methods that would work in non-marine shales.
Tom Woods. Velo, just a really quick question. You showed the D and C cost, the drilling completion.
Yeah.
About what percentage is completion and what percentage is drilling? I mean, I know it changes, but
right.
It's a general rule.
About 40% is drilling and 60% is completion. It depends. It can be anywhere from a third, two-thirds, half-half, but a 40-60 split is a good overall split.
So more than half is in completion.
That's correct. And probably it'll continue going up. There was we had a chance to go do a tour of the major service companies and some of the what I would call leading independents who use them. And one of the service companies has a goal of drilling 1 mile of horizontal well per day. So your 5,000-foot well, now the vertical well takes a little longer and you got to make the curve and all that, but zoom. And they showed settings where they've achieved that, also where they haven't achieved it, but that's their goal. And then you can begin to see that the drilling component becomes less and less over time.
Any, oh, okay, David Knapp. David Knapp, the current president of the International Association for Energy Economics.
Thank you, Guy Caruso, president of the U.S. Association. He told me a year or so ago, he says, guess what? Guess what? In a couple of years, you're going to be working for me. And I said, what? He said, didn't you hear I'm the president-elect of the USAEE? And I said, oh, congratulations. But actually, you're going to be working for me because I'm the president-elect of the IAEE. So here we go. Velo, this may be out-of-date news, but I was in Shanghai a couple of years ago and I talked to somebody fairly senior from Beijing, from one of the Ministry of Energy. And I said, so the shale isn't as good as you thought it was? And his answer was, we have no idea. He said, we've got so much conventional gas to get it hooked up and sent to the right places that we'll find out about the shale when that gets done. Does that ring true to you at all, or have we gone past that?
All right, so my first answer to that is it's partly true, but it's mostly true because of the constraints on infrastructure of getting the gas to the market, and the conventionals, of course, had a head start on that. The second part is they're now a major LNG importer. So the domestic demand is there. It just those linkages need to be built, and they are building them. And at that point, it will not be demand or conventional constraint, but it'll become more of a basically price constraint or things like that.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Mary Ann will be next.
Hi, Justin Montgomery. I'm a PhD candidate at MIT. I really appreciated your assessment of these resources. I was wondering if you could comment. So with the intensification of the stimulations and your very geological perspective, how do you anticipate the kind of tapping out of those gains? And also with tidal resources in other countries, do you think they'll follow a similar trajectory, or is there an opportunity to sort of leapfrog that with the intensification?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there is the opportunity for leapfrogging, assuming you build the base to be able to kind of adapt that technology to your settings. And the first question was, do I expect kind of some type of an asymptote on well performance improvements and things like that? I do. Our model basically looks at where the basin is and then does have a asymptotic relationship as to where they are now and then where they would be in future years itself. You know, it doesn't go on for infinite, but I think the most surprising thing has been there'll be some other breakthroughs that we can't anticipate at this point. And that'll probably bring another step change, whether it's, you know, the enhanced recovery. We talked about that EOG is doing. It has certain constraints and limits. We've looked at that pretty hard. We think it has applicability in other settings, but you have to plan for that ahead of time. You have to have confinement, you have to be able to build pressure, and a number of other things that are important. If you don't do that at the beginning, you probably will not be able to apply it. So there's some advanced planning for that, but there'll be other things that, you know, I can't even imagine, which will come about, but they're nowhere in our projections.
Mary Ann Kyle?
It's really more of a comment than a question, but what you haven't talked about is some of the above ground risks. Mm-hmm. And without private mineral rights in these countries, it's very difficult to get the public to put up with an industrial process in their backyard if you have no way of benefiting from it. And specifically, I wanted to ask you about China. My understanding of China is the whole regulatory structure makes it very difficult to develop shale, because shale, by definition, is an experimental process these days. Whereas if you have to submit a production plan and follow it to a T, you're clearly not going to get there. So can you talk more about some of these above ground challenges?
Yeah, no doubt the above ground challenges are significant. Many of these countries are starting not from where we had with 100 years of oil and gas development, infrastructure and service companies and all of that. So they'll have to rebuild that. But you have to have the quality resource there that if you are successful, you can bring it to market at reasonable prices itself. I think at some point the whole contracting process for developing unconventionals and taking leases will have to change from the current type of production sharing. These are more costly, more risky type of development activities, but we'll have to wait for the conventional production to begin to fall, like it is in Algeria. I think Algeria is kind of next on the list of countries that will move into this kind of space, and they'll need different contract terms to attract companies. Now, your question on China was whether they can hit these kinds of targets that they've laid out?
Whether the regulatory structure even allows you to develop shale,
yeah,
because you can't experiment. You're locked into a development plan.
Well, I had a chance to visit on-site PetroChina's activities. And it's as modern, as sophisticated as anything I've seen in the US. I was allowed to go into the frac trailer to look at because we know China the formations are compressed. They've been twisted and turned throughout the years. And so it's particularly interesting how the pressure was building up, and then would it just continue up, and it was high stress regime, they'd have to walk away. It broke over nicely, started to come down. All of the signs of a well-run, carefully, previously assessed type of operation. Now, the challenges to getting into that drill site and through the little local villages and not disturb the gardens and everything else that the local population relies on, yes, there'll be lots of these kinds of challenging cells. But we think they've made the challenge. We've made strides in exploration. We think they've made strides in terms of well drilling. I think their next challenge is really the whole completion process of the well.
Okay. Are there any last burning question before we adjourn for the next panel? If not, I'd like to thank Velo for an extremely informative presentation. And we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes here for panel number 3.
All right. Thank you. That was fun.
Yeah,
started if people can take their seats. That's what the bells mean. Okay, welcome back. Good afternoon, everybody. You're the crowd that gets to take an extra cookie because you lasted all day through the whole conference. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I am the Director of the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS, and want to welcome you guys back for the last session of today's conference on the near-term outlook for tight oil markets and growth in the United States. As Frank mentioned this morning, this is something that we've been working on for a long time, but very acutely over the last year, looking at the development of tight oil and shale gas resources in the United States and the contribution that that production makes to global markets, what it means to U.S. energy policy. And it's been a very rich and interesting discussion today. Just wanted to highlight a few of the things that Adam and myself and Lisa have been tweeting throughout the course of the day to sort of highlight some of the real insights that I think some of the speakers have brought. This morning, we talked on the first panel a lot about some of the production decisions and learnings that have been happening over really the last several years, but the differences that they've made in terms of people's expectations for what kind of production we're going to see in U.S. tight oil growth over the next 12 to 18 months. Things like lateral length, proppant density, ducts and abnormal ducts, like abnormal ducts. I expect people to come with icons of abnormal ducts next time. Base decline, sand market changes, fracture spacing, new technologies and methods, and even, thanks to Marianne, data and digitalization and the impact that that might have on drilling in the future. All things which, when added together and put through the lens of how managers of drilling operations and companies apply those learnings as they go through their own resource base that they have to work with, yield a really relatively divergent outlook in terms of what we can expect from tight oil in the near term and certainly over the longer term as well. Then we moved on to those pesky market dynamics and what people's expectations were. And I thought this was a really great panel where there seemed to be a consensus-ish that market investor expectations have certainly changed. And while discipline is what everybody is talking about, that manageable deficit spending might actually equal discipline over the near term as far as the market's concerned. But that there is a different expectation from the market, and Paul encouraged us all to listen to what the market is looking for and what its expectations are, that companies are going to start thinking about not just growth, but profitability as well. So we'll see how that works out. And then Velo did a wonderful job over lunch talking about the geology and the expectations for international tight oil and shale gas resources. I do think it's funny because it's a wonderful presentation. We've heard it as it has evolved over the years since they did it with the EIA initially. And one of the great things about it is, you have this recognition that, yes, in fact, the U.S. tight oil experience and shale gas experience evolved over a long period of time. But there is a sneaking expectation that around the world and in other countries, that learning process might not be quite as long. There are still constraints, but it is still an area worth watching for not surprises, but developments that are consequential. And so I think that was a really valuable contribution. I am thrilled to have the panel that is going to focus on potential constraints, not because I'm a contrarian by nature, although some folks have accused me of such, but it's a great panel that's going to talk about some of the things that have been alluded to over the course of the day, but certainly come up in most of the conversations that we have about the near-term potential and medium-term potential for tight oil production here in the United States. So we have with us today Rusty Brazil, who is no stranger to CSIS. Rusty is the President and Principal Energy Markets Consultant for RBN Energy. Rusty is also around here known as the guy who launched the push for the freedom of hydrocarbons from the U.S. market with a very interesting presentation that started at the sort of up ramp of the U.S. crude exports debate. Rusty does a lot of work. RBN in general provides energy market advisory services, specializing in strategy, acquisitions, and divestitures. Rusty is going to talk about some of the constraints to growth on sort of the physical side, so the pipelines, the trucks, some of the things that Artem alluded to in his presentation in the morning, but didn't get into some of the details. And then next, we're going to turn to Tisha Schuler. And Tisha, again, is not a stranger to CSIS, has been here before. Tisha used to run, was the president and CEO of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association and is a strategic advisor to Stanford University's Natural Gas Initiative. She now has her own company called Adamantine Energy. I did that right? Good, I've been practicing. And spends her time writing, consulting, and doing some public speaking. Tisha was last here in 2016, where we were having a conference about the future of U.S. energy policy and whether or not we were going to be able to navigate our way through some of the regulatory and social constraints that we see emerging at the local and state level. She's going to talk a little bit more about some of those above ground issues that sometimes we feel, get sort of glibly thrown into the mix. But actually in the U.S. context are really important to understand whether or not local communities, state-level communities, and quite frankly, if we roll the clock back 2 years ago, at even a national level federal discussion, opposition to drilling and activity in the tight oil space certainly arose, particularly around hydraulic fracturing. And then finally, the guy who gets the biggest award today is Amrit Naresh from ESAI, because he, as of yesterday, about 4 o'clock or so, didn't kind of know he was going to be here. Sarah Emerson unfortunately got sick, and so Amrit works with Sarah and has kindly agreed to present her presentation, which focuses on the refining market constraints. So all of this production is great as long as you have a place to sell it. And they're going to talk about some of those market dynamics, their perspective, Amrit and Sarah's perspective on what some of the considerations we should think about there. Amrit, in his day job, produces ESAI Energy's Global Diesel Outlook, Asia Watch, and Middle East Watch publications as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rusty, and we'll get this show on the road.
Thanks, Sarah. Pleasure to be with you again. If I can get the slides working here. Can't get the slides working here. There we go. All right. So whenever I do these, I try my best to work in song titles for these things. And so we got to get out of this place. It's obvious that had to be the song title for this one, right? Animals, 1966. For those of you who are not alive in 1966, I recommend that you Google it up and you'll find out what's going on here. This first slide that I've got, it's Frank's favorite slide that I do, so I always do it every time for Frank. It's particularly, I think, important this time, and we've talked about the crude oil stuff ad nauseum now, so I'm going to skip over crude oil and go to the fact that it's the same for gas. It's the same for gas liquids. Natural gas production in the lower 48 in the United States is 78 BCF right now. It is just absolutely astronomical. So when we look at transportation or constraints on production from crude oil, shouldn't it cross our mind that maybe this could be just as much of a constraint as crude oil takeaway capacity? Same thing on NGLs. NGLs didn't even hiccup. NGLs are twice the production that they were 6 or 7 years ago, growing like crazy, didn't even slow down when prices crashed in 2014. And should it not occur to us that these two commodities, gas and gas liquids, could possibly cause problems for crude oil producers? And I think they very well will. They very well could. We're going to be more conservative than some of the other presentations that you saw this morning. So we're talking about, in our base case, somewhere up between 13 million barrels a day on crude oil in the U.S. Certainly saw numbers a lot bigger than that happening sooner. A lot depends on exactly what your productivity improvement scenario looks like, as we talked about, and we assume very little. That's not because we don't believe it's going to be happening. It's simply because we don't know how to forecast it. And secondly, we've got a conservative price forecast in here, a little better than a forward curve. So that means at a $52, $53, $54 price out a few years from now, we don't see quite the increase that we saw in some of the other presentations. That might be a good thing when we start looking at those other commodities. Because lower 48 natural gas up somewhere in the 90s, in the next 5 years. And again, that could be a lot higher if crude oil production is higher, because a lot of the growth is coming from associated gas and NGLs from natural gas processing, up to 9 million barrels a day, or sorry, 6 million barrels a day. So there's a lot of production coming on very, very quickly. And you got to ask yourself, well, how is this going to play out? If you look at things in the individual basins, Bakken is about up to where it was before. And so, you know, you ask the question, is there going to be a crude oil takeaway capacity problem in the Bakken? Answer, no. DAPL took care of that. There's ample takeaway capacity in the Bakken for the next few years because of DAPL and the other pipelines that were there before DAPL got built. But the problem is gas and NGLs. Now, that doesn't say that there's not a number of projects that are already in the works right now in order to be able to relieve those constraints as they develop over the next few years. But those projects have got to be built, and they've got to be built on time. Same thing goes for Niobrara and Anadarko. Production back up to about where they were in 2014, 2015. So production's back up. Generally speaking, I don't have a big problem with crude oil takeaway, but gas and NGLs, same issue. Eagle Ford. Eagle Ford really hasn't recovered back to where it was at the peak of 2014, 2015. So as it stands right now, we still don't have a problem for crude oil, gas, or NGLs. Could happen if some of the scenarios that we looked at this morning transpire. But there's the Permian. Permian growing like crazy. Permian has problems not only with the potential for crude oil, but for gas, for NGLs, and water too. So I'm certainly not saying that these other guys might not have problems eventually, but the big issue is now about the Permian and how the Permian responds to the kind of production growth that we've seen over the past few years and what's going forward. Well, what's going on in terms of Permian crude oil takeaway capacity? A lot's going on. Is the pipeline projects you've seen here. I'm not going to go over each one of them in detail, but suffice to say, there are 9 projects that have been announced publicly. That's 3 million barrels a day of incremental capacity coming on. All of it comes on in the next 2 years. There's at least 2 projects that have been announced kind of at the talking stage over and above these. And so if you take our production forecast and lay it against the production forecast, or lay it against all of those pipeline projects on a stack chart like what we've got here, this would tell you that if you believe our production forecast, these guys are not going to have a problem anytime soon if all of those projects get built. Now, do I think all of those projects are going to get built? Probably not. Do I think they're going to be built on time? Probably not. But nevertheless, from our perspective, it does look like that, well, the Permian is probably in decent shape on crude oil pipeline takeaway capacity because the energy industry is so interested in making sure that this problem gets solved. And we think it is going to get solved. But, and there's a big but here, it's natural gas. The gas is centralized around the Waha trading hub. Natural gas trades out of the Permian around Waha. There are 2 ways to get that gas west. 2.9 BCF on Transwestern and El Paso, basically going to the West Coast market. About 0.95 BCF going north on NGPL and Northern. Around 3.4 BCF going to the east, to the Houston Ship Channel and to the Dallas market. And there is 3.1 BCF of capacity that has been built in order to move gas from the Permian to Mexico over the course of the last couple of years. But as was alluded to this morning, there is a problem. The problem is there's only about 6% of that capacity being used today. Only 6% of the gas is actually flowing in that capacity because either the pipelines or the power plants that were originally envisioned to use that capacity, that 3.1 BCF, they're not there. Therefore, at least with our forecast, it's going to take at least a year or so before those pipelines are flowing even up to a BCF a day. So even though the capacity is theoretically there, practically speaking, it's really not there. Which means, if you add all those numbers up, there's about 8.5 BCF of usable takeaway capacity out of the Permian. And that's it, at least for a while. There's the bigger problem. That's Permian production over the course, natural gas production, over the course of the last 3 years. Up somewhere around a BCF and a half over the 2 years ago, and then last year, up about a BCF and a half each, up to 7.5 BCF today. 7.5 BCF, 8.5 BCF of takeaway capacity. That means that sometime in the next few months, and maybe sooner rather than later, production is going to exceed takeaway capacity out of the Permian. There is no way that any pipeline can be built to solve this problem. There's no such thing as building a pipeline in time. The earliest pipeline that could be built in time is the Kinder Morgan pipeline, Gulf Coast Express, 2 BCF a day, taking that gas down to Corpus Christi. If things go well, if things go right, sometime in the second half of 2019, that pipeline could be completed. There's 3 other pipelines we've got on here: the Pecos Trail from Americo, the Boardwalk Sempra P2K, a Permian to Katy project, or the Tellurian Pipeline Global Access Pipeline getting over to Gillis, Louisiana. Those pipelines could very well happen, but not in 2019, and probably not in 2020. At least it's going to take a while before those pipelines get built. And in the meantime, Permian producers have a problem. That's what the problem looks like on a stack chart. Our production forecast is the red line that you see there. Those areas where there's a dashed circle says that during those periods of time, there is less takeaway capacity out of the Permian than our production forecast in the Permian. So something has to happen. Will the Texas Railroad Commission allow that kind of flaring to take place? Rules are completely ambiguous. If you look at what's said, I think as you mentioned this morning, the rules say basically if you want 90 days, we'll give you 90 days at the staff level. We'll give you another 90 days at the staff level, up to 180 days. And then you've got to ask the commission yourself for each and every well. It's not like the aggregated rules that existed up in North Dakota a few years when they were doing a lot of flaring. Railroad Commission is untested in terms of how they would handle pipeline takeaway capacity constraints on natural gas production. Everything so far has basically happened at the wellhead. So that happens. Kinder Morgan builds their pipeline constraints go away for a while, but production catches up again, and sometime in the 2021 period, the problem is right back in the laps of the producers. How bad could that problem get? This is our forecast for production if everything goes right, or for basis if everything goes right. So during this year, if everything goes right, the basis is averaging somewhere around 70 cents under Henry Hub. And that continues until production runs out. Well, there's a lot of folks that we talk to that says we'll never get through this year, and it'll probably happen sometime in the latter half of this year because production is going to increase faster than we had in our forecast. I wouldn't argue with that. What it does say is by the time we get out to some point in the future, and that future is only a few months away, then the basis in the Permian is going to drop in that forecast to around $2 below Henry Hub. The forward curve is not too far away from that level right now. When we first started talking about this about 6-8 months ago, people would look at this and say, that's crazy. Well, this January, basis popped out to about $1, and now there's a lot of folks that believe this could happen. There's 2 catches to this slide. Catch number 1, it doesn't get well until a new pipeline gets built. If that's the Kinder Morgan pipeline, then the Kinder Morgan pipeline has to get built and sometimes in the fourth quarter of 2019, or that very, very cheap price stays around until that pipeline gets built. That's the only thing that will relieve that sort of transportation constraint. Here's the bigger catch. That breaks our model. We don't really have a scenario built into our model that accommodates this. So the $2 there is basically a floor that's in the model that says if basis gets to $2 below Henry, you could build another pipeline, but you can't get another pipeline built in time. So the price, as far as our model concerned, goes infinitely negative. Well, price is not going to go infinitely negative. Could Permian prices go negative? Yes, they could. They went negative in ACO in Canada this past summer, right? It happened. Could it happen here? Yeah. Why? Because we've been talking about rates of return all day. Think about the scenario that we're looking at here, where the producers are getting the majority of their rates of return not on natural gas, but on crude oil and natural gas liquids. As a matter of fact, if you look at the rates of return, the break-even prices for a lot of the players in the Permian, not a lot of players, many of the players in the Permian, the break-even prices for their natural gas are negative numbers. Negative $2, negative $3. We've seen examples where a producer can make a zero rate of return, or make a 10% DCF ROI rate of return with a natural gas price of minus $12. Now, no producer is going to sell their gas for minus $12, but I might sell my gas for minus $1 or minus $2 if my choice is to stop drilling, because that becomes the constraint on my behavior, is to stop drilling new wells for oil that I can make money on because I can't move the gas. So why didn't people get out there and start, running the backhoes right now? Well, they are running the backhoes right now. They just can't get done before sometime in 2019. And therefore, we're in a situation that we really haven't seen before. When prices crashed in the Rockies 10 years ago, it was when prices got low, natural gas prices got low, it was dry gas, people stopped drilling. This situation is take away capacity constraint out of a region where the economics are based primarily on crude oil, not by natural gas. And that is a world that we've never seen before. But we're going to know how this plays out sometime in the next few months. Well, you would think with the producers in the Permian with that kind of problem on their hands, they don't need any other problems, but they do have one. And that is Permian produced water. Could there be enough water in the Permian to cause the Permian a problem with their production of crude oil, with their takeaway of crude oil? Well, yes, they could. Conventional crude oil in the Permian comes along with somewhere between 10, 12, 13 barrels a day of water for every barrel of crude oil that's produced. It's been that way for a long time. The older the well gets, the more water it produces. Generally speaking, this conventional well-produced water hasn't been and is still not a big problem. Number one, production's falling in these conventional wells, so whatever worked last year, it's going to work a little better this year. And secondly, and the more important thing, is that in a conventional reservoir, the water that's produced can be pumped back into the reservoir where it came from. Water flooding, right? EOR, enhanced oil recovery. So the water that's coming out of those conventional reservoirs has an easy home right next door. It's the way it's worked since time began, and it hasn't been an issue. But conventional, unconventional, less water per barrel of oil, somewhere around 3-ish or so, but that's where production is increasing, and those are low permeability formations, right? So I can't just turn around and pump that water right back down to where it came from. I've got to cart it off someplace into a saltwater disposal well. Many of these wells are further away. What's happened in Oklahoma with seismic activity has certainly spooked a lot of people in West Texas, saying, I don't want West Texas to fall off in the Gulf of Mexico. So what that means then is that I have to usually truck this water further and further away to saltwater disposal wells because I can't dispose most of it right there on my drilling site. Now, a lot of producers are trying to figure out ways in order to be able to use more of this water for frack water, and that's a good thing. But that doesn't even scratch the surface of how much water we're really talking about here. That's what's happened over the course of the last few years. So unconventional and the light blue been declining. That's because unconventional production has been declining. So unconventional was essentially 100% of everything back 5 or 6 years ago. Now it's about half. So about half the water that is being produced right now is being produced from unconventional production. That's where the growth is occurring. Last year we hit the milestone that water produced in the Permian from unconventional was basically the same as conventional, about 17 million barrels a day. At our production forecast, remember conservative, you could very easily hit the low 30s, low 30 million barrels a day sometime within the next 4 or 5 years. That is a lot of water, way more water than you can handle with trucks. So there's a number of companies, midstream water treatment companies and handling companies that have sprung up that are intended just to solve this very problem that we have here. But the infrastructure has to be put in place. You have to do a lot of planning in advance in order to make that happen. And if the planning doesn't happen and I can't get rid of my water and I can't get that many trucks or that many truck drivers, then I'm only stuck with one other thing, and that is to drill less wells. So it's a very interesting world that we're going into right now, where the market seems to be basically in front of crude oil takeaway capacity, but is it in these other products, and I haven't talked about NGLs, but NGLs has many of the same issues, particularly with gas processing, where I've got to put a lot of infrastructure in place to handle everything that comes along with that crude. And that very well may end up being the constraint that faces this market over the next 5 years. Just kind of make the point on that. With crude oil, one of the things I can do is I can always put crude oil on trucks. I may not like the price, I may not like where the trucks are going to be able to go, but at least if I've got crude oil production coming on strong in the Scoop and Stack or the Permian and the Delaware Basin or wherever, I can put my crude oil on trucks and haul it a long ways away. I cannot put natural gas on trucks, and there's only a limited amount of additional water that I can put on trucks, and that's what's entirely possible that could break this market. And with that happy thought, it's a pleasure talking to you, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
All right, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Sarah, thanks for having me. Frank, thanks for having me back. So we're going to switch gears. There are no charts in this presentation, so you can rest your eyes for a moment, because we're going to talk about risks broadly defined as the social, the political, the policy components of our society that can essentially stall, delay, or cancel your project. So everything that Rusty just talked about in the context of social risk. There are 3 communities that we'll talk about primarily: the actual communities where projects are being built, the regulatory community, including the elected officials that have to engage, and then of course the companies and the investors. I'll focus my remarks today primarily on the perspective of the companies and their investors. But it's important to recognize that this is happening in a very broad context where things are shifting pretty rapidly. So there was an old way we could think about risk. It was primarily regulatory. It was permitting. How do you get your permits? What are the things you need essentially to get your project built? This was constrained within a company, usually isolated in the Department of PR or maybe regulatory. And essentially, there were a small number of actors that you had to engage with, maybe a local permitting agency or a state permitting agency. And this worked, and it wasn't that long ago. It was just a few years ago. So the landscape has changed
dramatically. And ultimately, these risks are now key considerations in a project. They can derail a project at any stage of its development, even quite late in construction. It materially affects the way you envision a project, and I'll give some examples that will illustrate why. And it's more than siting. So it's easy to think about this of where am I going to locate my well or my pipeline, how am I going to route it? But ultimately, the way things are changing is such that even the way a project is envisioned at the drawing room floor and the time it's going to take and the people that will be involved to get it built are changing fundamentally. I'm from Colorado, so I would expect you to have a bias that we're just crazy and things are difficult in Colorado. But we are seeing that we are exporting our problems to the rest of you. So take some of these things. I would predict if I were to come back in 2 years, at least 3 of you will come up to me and say, I thought I would never see it here. Pick your town in Texas or North Dakota, but in fact, we have. And I do get those calls now. So I don't really need to give you examples. I don't think that social risk can derail projects. There's plenty of drama around Keystone, Dakota Access, banning fracking in New York. We know that social risk can cost years and millions, if not billions of dollars in lost time and delays and projects even being shelved. So we're going to look at this at 3 scales and looking, I am ultimately an optimist, but our panel is about constraints. So we're going to focus on headwinds at these 3 scales. Globally and nationally, there are conversations that will affect your project at a city or regional level, so we'll look at that. Most of the regulatory rubber meets the road at the state level. But even the pressures there are shifting, and I'll actually draw from a couple of Rusty's examples to talk about how these headwinds can affect, even further complicate some of these constraints. And then the new front is local. It's unpredictable, it's diverse, it is ever changing. As soon as you have any idea what's happening, you're gonna have someone with a new, wonderful way to make your project more difficult. Okay, so and then at the end I'll give you some suggestions. So there will be a potential for an optimistic front into this. What can you do? What can you do about these things? So speaking globally and nationally, I'm only going to give 3 examples. There are many more, but I thought I'd pick 3 that we can understand quite succinctly. So the first one is investor and shareholder expectations. So there's a very broad conversation happening internationally about moving to 100% renewables or a zero carbon conversation. It's easy to think this is irrelevant to your domestic project, but ultimately it is influencing the way investors are setting their expectations for companies, both private equity and also shareholders. So if I had one chart, which I don't, but if I did, it would be to show you how shareholders have shifted the expectations on companies. And you're probably familiar with these examples, but you might not have thought of them in this time scale. So in 2014, shareholders asked for greenhouse gas 2-degree scenarios on Exxon and Oxy. These got somewhere between 20 and 30% of the vote from the shareholders. By 2017, these passed by over 60%. So we know that momentum is building in a direction that's going to make these questions more relevant. To think downstream, because it shows how much this conversation has become to dominate the entire value chain. Electric utilities in 2014, there were 4 shareholder resolutions focused on greenhouse gas emissions. By 2017, there were 17 initiatives. None of these have passed yet, but you can see the trend of where they're going. So companies are spending a lot of energy on these outside elements. A second piece that I'll bring up is the Divest Movement. Once the purview of college campuses and protests and kind of easy to dismiss in the context of developing your pipeline project. But this is translating to making it acceptable for local governments or state regulatory agencies to consider themselves part of the Divest Movement and participating in the goals of the Divest Movement. So this is played out right here in Washington, D.C. a couple years ago. The local government passed a resolution to reduce fossil fuel use within the limits of the district by 80% by 2050. So we could maybe shrug that off too. It's a symbolic resolution, except that then the pension board, the retirement board here, voted to divest $6.4 billion from fossil fuels. So we went from symbolic initiative to $6.4 billion of investment funds. And again, what this does is create a climate where in a local government, it's now acceptable to take almost any step necessary to delay or stop a project related to fossil fuels. We'll talk about that more in just a second. And then the macro political wins. We all know people that imagined in a Trump administration that the environment for energy development would become more friendly. In fact, what it's done at a state and local level is invigorated opposition in such a way that they feel they can participate in stopping energy projects by any means necessary. So in Colorado, for example, one suburb, Lafayette, Colorado, had an initiative that had the votes to pass in their city council to legalize nonviolent direct action protests, sit-ins, strikes, blockades, of any drilling activity without fear of being prosecuted. So you can imagine how dramatically this could change the landscape in which you're operating when anyone can chain themselves to your backhoe. And now suddenly Rusty's pipelines are never going to get built because those people not only are immune from prosecution, they're actually encouraged for this type of action. It was not taken for a vote, but I think it shows the level of interest in transforming the conversation pretty deeply. Okay, so that's national. So let's move to where it actually gets more complicated and difficult. So at the regional level, the state level, within the last 10 years, this is where we've seen almost all regulation happening, and where most of the conversations, even two of the examples Rusty cited, were ultimately going to be informed by state regulation, whether the Railroad Commission would allow flaring, how many disposal wells get permitted. So it matters the pressures that a state regulatory commission are under. A couple new fronts for these discussions. One is infrastructure is aging, so there is a risk of more incidents. And when you have any incident now, for reasons that we'll discuss in a couple minutes, when you have any incident, it garners a lot more attention and it creates a lot more pressure. The other piece is that where it was historically no big deal to replace infrastructure, say you're replacing your gathering lines or you're replacing some natural gas utility pipelines, these are now the new scenario that communities or activists that want to stop fossil fuel development are approaching. I have even participated in a project where a water line was being protested just because someone thought it might have fossil fuels in it. So there's a sense that if there's a backhoe and there's a pipeline and something's happening, this is an opportunity for us to transform the energy economy as we know it. And things that weren't even on the radar as controversial, like switching out your gathering lines, now you could actually have full engagement in the hearings, full engagement in the protests. On the state regulatory front, what we see now is that activists that are community focused are turning out. Every legislative hearing, historically, this was the inside baseballers would go to a state legislative hearing or a straight regulatory hearing. It was the same 15 of us paying attention. Now you might have 200 people turning out. In Colorado, they had to limit public comment at hearings to 3 hours at 3 minutes apiece just to get the business of the commission done. So this really changes things, and it does affect pragmatic regulators or policymakers of all types. When you have 300 people lining up to tell you you shouldn't do this, it affects the dynamics. And so if we were talking about flaring at the Railroad Commission, I don't anticipate that this will be the front lines next year, but maybe in 2 years. And you saw that same kind of turnout. This would be one more component of these constraints that are worth being aware of and thinking about it. Certainly pressure, for example, in Oklahoma on disposal well is something that is turning into pressure in all states. In Colorado, it's very difficult to permit a disposal well right now. So last area at the state level, I'll just give as an example of new front lines. Probably not creating a great case that we have a lot of sanity happening in Colorado, but we had a 16-year-old petition our commission, the state regulatory body, for a hearing on the prioritization of environmental and health and safety in oil and gas resources. The commission, in a pretty standard vote, declined to hear the 16-year-old's petition. This went through a legal battle. We're in the second or third year of it now. It's going up to our state Supreme Court, and it's taking a lot of airtime and sucking a lot of energy out of the room. But here's what's interesting. Many of you may have read an article circulated by investors to investors about the smothering effect this would have on oil and gas development in Colorado. So I spent many, many months trying to articulate the actual reality of a petition like that. But what matters to companies is this affects their ability to get capital, the cost of that capital, and the general pressures going on at the state level in terms of development. Okay. So this takes us to the local level, where things really get crazy right now. So just a few examples. There are, in fact, in Colorado, in every single jurisdiction, there is a local community organization. These are concerned citizens with reasonable, interested perspectives about the oil and gas development happening in their community. But it's not straightforward to engage. In one community, Broomfield, there's 3 separate organizations that have organized because they have different tactics or needs or priorities. In Colorado, we've seen in addition to ballot initiatives at the state level, we're on our second round now of ballot initiatives at the local level. So Broomfield, which passed a voter-led initiative to make oil and gas development more difficult, and then it was overturned legally, just passed a second initiative. So we're seeing that this is an area that's going to become increasingly complex. I think particularly interesting and a very recent development, a group of community members came together, pressured the city council, and is now negotiating directly with the companies drilling in their communities for best management practices, for conditions of approval on the permit. So this is, you can imagine this is time intensive. It's not a huge, the investment companies need to make in these things are not relevant on the scale of capital expenditures, but the time and the thinking and the creative energy necessary is certainly significant. And then, I know you know this, but social media. This is changing everything. Any incident is now widely and repeatedly broadcast. And you can't have a conversation anywhere. So at a local hearing or at a regulatory, if a company spokesperson or an elected official stands up, there's 50 phones on them. If any of you have had this experience, you know what it feels like. 50 phones on you, recording your every word, taking them out of context, and then making GIFs of them and posting them on the internet. And if you don't know what a GIF is, you should ask your children or hire someone under 30 on your staff. So this is the reality of permitting now. And then I mentioned it before, but it's important to recognize that groups are forming focused on the purpose of radical direct action. This is something we've seen in pipelines on the East Coast for a long time, but focusing now on E&P sites, on specific gathering lines going in. This is a new component that we're seeing more and more. Okay, so how do you manage the risk? Turning to the empowering part of creating your own tailwinds for this conversation. There's 3 suggestions I have. The first is that conception of a project, any project, upstream, midstream, downstream, even utility pipe replacement, it's critical to map all the points at which a permit, a legislative or a regulatory approval could factor in. These now have many, many chapters, every hearing, first reading, second reading. These are all opportunities for your project to be delayed now. As part of this mapping, the stakeholders involved, it's much more complicated than it used to be. Stakeholders are neighbors, they're local elected officials, they're county elected officials. They go on and on to the chamber. And some of these stakeholders are going to be positive contributors. They're not going to be positive contributors if they don't know you. So that's a key component. The second is these conversations have to be engaged with leadership and operations. So if you have a separate team that's working on community engagement, which most companies do, it's time to bring the whole team together to map these risks and contemplate them. So the best led community engagement team cannot overcome whatever your land team went out there and whoever they pissed off in the process. Every component of the project, from the first land negotiations through the construction, through operations to final reclamation, is a relationship building opportunity and also an opportunity for peril. So these are really important parts of it. The other thing is that most leadership and operations are unfamiliar with the pressures of these projects. So everything looks easy, of course, in the drawing room, the conference room, and just like everything looks easy on a map before you get out into the field, it's really important that leadership and operations is engaging with communities and regulators to understand the pressures that they're under. The last thing, I say this as a consultant, move all this stuff in-house. You should not have consultants out there negotiating and creating relationships on behalf of your project. Is there anything you would hate more than a consultant coming to your house and negotiating with you with no authority? So communities, local regulators, state regulators, they want to talk to the people in charge. They want to talk to the engineers. And frankly, the engineers and operations leaders need to understand the pressure that local governments and state regulators are on. If companies feel like they're getting squeezed, it's nothing compared to the squeeze that a state regulator feels or an elected city council member who's running into neighbors at the grocery store. So bringing it in-house and making sure that companies are engaging the people with the authority to make these changes. This is not a superficial exercise anymore. This has to be deeply transformative to the way we engage and the way we do business. Now, I am an optimist. I do think it's possible. If you haven't experienced these challenges, they are coming. If I come back here in 2 years and they haven't come, I will buy you a beer. So if they are coming, as I think that they are, this has to fundamentally change the way we think about and engage these challenges in the work we're doing. If you're thinking about the constraints that Rusty talked about, then we need to pile onto that the regulatory approvals that are going to make them possible. And if you're working in an area that's more complicated, anywhere in the East, all of these things layer on to really important effect. It's going to change all of us. It's going to change the way we do business, but fundamentally, it's doable. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Tisha, and thank you, Sarah and CSIS, for hosting this discussion. My name is Amrit Naresh. I'm the Global Diesel Analyst at ESAI Energy. I'm here filling in for Sarah Emerson, who I think some of you know, and she sends her best regards, wishes she could be here, but I will do my best to fill her shoes today. So I'll be presenting kind of a collection of research from ESAI Energy, some of Sarah's work and also some of the work of Christopher Barber, who is our manager of refining analysis. And we've been asked to talk about demand for shale crude on an international basis. Not only how much can domestic refiners take in, but what does the demand picture look like over the next several years around the world. So these are the two starting points that we're going to talk about, and we're going to discuss a few of the some of the downside risks and some of the potential upsides that we see coming over the next several years. And pretty firmly believe that there's a market for shale product if the price is right. And so we've seen with the OPEC production cuts a little bit less support for U.S. crude being taken in by refiners abroad as sweet-sour spreads widen, with less sour crude flowing to markets from the Middle East or from OPEC and OPEC cooperating countries. So we'll see how that affects things going forward, and we'll discuss that. So first, looking at the U.S. market, we're pretty close to saturation in terms of how much shale oil the U.S. market can take in. This chart will be familiar to most of you. I believe Sarah was here in 2014, shortly before the price collapse, and ESAI was pretty bearish on demand for U.S. crude at the time. Sarah said that that refiners that there were limits to how much shale oil refiners could take in, and that the market would become oversupplied, and indeed the price collapse bore that out. Going forward, we're somewhat cautious, but we do see shale oil production eventually exceeding 12 million barrels per day, not by 2020, but probably by 2022 or 2023. A couple of key moments in here: the lifting of the crude oil export ban in December 2015 obviously opened up the world to U.S. shale, and the OPEC deal, the OPEC Plus deal that was reached at the end of 2016 changed the landscape substantially also for light tight U.S. oil. Widening differentials between sweet and sour crudes has flown a little bit in the face of U.S. exports, U.S. efforts to export its light oil, and we'll discuss the OPEC deal a little bit more going forward. So, just a brief look at the domestic refining situation in the U.S. If we're looking at light, medium, and heavy crude, let's look first at medium and heavy. There's not a lot of scope for medium and heavy demand to fall much further among U.S. refiners. We do see shale displacing some some imports of medium crude by way of blending. We don't see much scope for demand for heavy crude oil imports to diminish. A lot of refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast have spent years investing in delayed coking, in hydrocracking, in processing the bottom of the barrel. So they're well configured to take in this heavy crude, and we don't see light oil from the U.S. displacing that very much. And in terms of imports for both medium, in terms of imports for both medium and heavy, we see imports of medium falling somewhat as a result of more blending of U.S. light oil, but not to zero, more like falling to about 500,000 or 600,000 barrels per day, and we do not see heavy crude oil imports falling very much because of these refinery configurations that I just mentioned. Moving to light oil, this illustrates from another angle much of what we've discussed today. Upstream developments have really pushed out a substantial share of the U.S. imports of light crude. You can see by pad level, most of these imports of light oil are coming from pads 1 and 5, so that's the East Coast and the West Coast. East Coast pulling a lot of crude from the West Coast of Africa. That is unlikely to change very much, so there's not going to be there's not going to be, the East Coast refineries are not going to contribute a lot of additional demand for shale oil. There's simply no way to get it there in increasing volumes. But we do see on the whole that demand for light oil among US refiners, we see it increasing by about 250,000 barrels per day between now and 2020. So that's something, but not very much. So I think we're going to increasingly look towards export markets. Before we get to the export markets, just zooming in a little bit on the US Gulf Coast, you can see the same trend here that light oil imports are being displaced, or have been over the last several years at a pretty high rate in both Louisiana and Texas subregions. So here you see this kind of a rehashing of the increase in the Gulf Coast demand for light oil coming from the shale basins. So with the lifting of the export ban, U.S. crude has debuted to the rest of the world. It's been an opportunity for refiners in other regions to taste it, sniff it, smell it, see how it works with their refinery configurations. I think an earlier speaker mentioned that a lot of mid-sized producers are finding themselves suddenly as exporters. So there's a bit of experimentation going on. I think what happened in 2017 was instructive in terms of the potential for the rest of the world to pick up more of these exports coming from the U.S. So average exports in 2017 ended up averaging about 1.1 million barrels per day. You can see the breakdown by region. Canada, Europe, and Asia Pacific receiving the most. I'm going to show you now a slightly different take on the data from last year. These are the actual average volumes, but if you look at Europe, and these are not numbers taken all from, these are not figures taken all from the same month, but this is the highest month of data for each of these countries in Europe. So if actual exports to Europe last year were about 280,000 barrels per day, if every country imported its maximum from the year over the course of the year, the potential is over 750,000 barrels per day going to Europe. So there's at least nominally potential for a pretty large upswing in exports to Europe. In terms of other regions, looking at Asia Pacific, if we went from, if we exported 400,000 barrels per day last year, the potential using the same kind of back of the envelope methodology, the potential is for over 1 million barrels per day flowing from the U.S. to Asian markets in years coming. So the bottom line there is that foreign markets can take more. Now, of course, it's not an easy task for mid-size or any producer who has not exported in the past to find the right market for the crude. Who has the appetite? Who has the crude slate? And this is from our global refining database, where we track refinery configurations and crude and product slates for every refinery in the world. This is a very quick and dirty way of trying to understand where is light oil most in demand. The yellow dots are the least complex refineries. The red dots are the most complex refineries with the most secondary processing units, delayed cokers, hydrocrackers, catalytic crackers, the kinds of things that are configured to be profitable even processing heavier or more sour crudes. So the more yellow dots, in theory, on this map, the more opportunities for exports of light oil from the U.S. As you can see, most of this, well, the next several years, we're going to see pretty substantial increases in capacity in global refining capacity. Asia and the Middle East are the heavyweights in this regard. They're going to be leading the way in globally adding about 6.8 million barrels per day of refining capacity between now and 2022, so over the next 5 years. Compare this to the last 5 years, and global refining capacity increases were only about half that, about 3.3 million barrels per day. Disguised in that is some refining capacity being taken offline, especially in OECD Asia, with Japan and Korea trying to rationalize their refining capacity amid slowing domestic demand. But so we are set for a large increase in refining capacity, and in Asia, the bulk of that is coming in China. One region we haven't looked at in so much detail yet is Latin America. There's a little bit less potential here, but we do see kind of on a maximum, probably about 75,000 barrels per day of additional U.S. crude exports to Latin America based on ongoing developments in Brazil and Mexico, where obviously the refineries that have been offline that have faced operational troubles over the last couple of years are starting to come back, but any new distillation capacity that's going to be coming on in Brazil is being configured to process offshore Brazilian oil. So I mean that's heavier and more sour than shale oil from the U.S. And in Mexico, most of the refinery investment taking place there is in the form of residual fuel oil upgrading, and this is in anticipation of another issue that I haven't heard mentioned today, but the IMO rules on marine sulfur. I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail, but in Mexico, most of the investments are to reduce the quality of the output of high sulfur fuel oil in favor of lower sulfur fuels. So in some sense, there's an opportunity for U.S. light crude to make it to Mexico, but more as a blending feedstock for the refineries there. In Asia, I'll skip over more of this. I've mentioned, most of the refining capacity increases in Asia are coming from China. So one of the biggest reasons to be bullish about the opportunity for U.S. exports of crude is the IMO rules coming on in 2020. IMO being the International Maritime Organization, agency of the UN that sets sulfur regulations. And you can kind of see an evolution of marine fuel requirements. Before 2012, the limit of sulfur in the oceans was 4.5%. In 2012, it was reduced to 3.5%. In 2015, parts of Northern Europe and the coastal parts of North America implemented the ecozones, which have much more stringent sulfur requirements than other parts of the world, 0.1%. In 2016, China implemented its own eco rules, which were slightly less ambitious, but still 0.5% sulfur requirements in China. This is not being enforced everywhere in China, but originally it was being enforced at five marine terminals, and 6 more were added to that list in 2017. So at a total of 11 ports in China, these relatively stringent eco sulfur requirements are now in place. So, but by January 1st, 2020, the rules will change across the oceans, 0.5% globally. Now, there are a lot of issues with actual implementation of this, but in theory, this will really boost demand for sweeter crude and will benefit refiners who are configured to take in more sweet crude, but also other refiners who are configured to really desulfurize fuel oil and some of the heavier product that they might be receiving. So one question that's relevant for the potential of U.S. exports is how ship owners will satisfy demand. If currently, with no IMO rules, this would be the division of, this would be the share of high sulfur fuel oil being used in the marine bunkers market. This would be the share of lower sulfur gas oil being used in the ecozones we just mentioned. In 2020, that is going to shift, and this dividing line is somewhat up for debate. But our view is that there's going to be at least a shift of about 1 million barrels per day away from high sulfur fuel oil and towards lower sulfur marine gas oil to be used as bunkers. And so the larger the share of the lower sulfur gas oil that ships require, the bigger the opportunity for U.S. exports of light oil. So refiners around the world face a bewildering challenge. They don't know exactly what compliance will be among ship owners. Most ships have at least 2 tanks that can have high sulfur fuel in one tank, low sulfur fuel in another tank, and depending on the amount of cheating, the more cheating on these sulfur rules, the less need there is for lower sulfur crude among the world's refiners. And so refiners need to make decisions. They're going to be adjusting their crude slate, which generally will favor light oil. The crude slate is going to move lighter and sweeter. On the other side, countervailing that, if refiners choose to invest in more residual upgrading capacity, more secondary processing units, that reduces the need for lighter, sweeter oil to fulfill that marine demand. They could also divert vacuum gas oil that they're currently using in fluid catalytic crackers. They could divert that to the marine gas oil market, so that would also mitigate the need for lighter, sweeter crude in their refinery crude slate. And of course, they could also pull more lower sulfur fuel oil from for power generation and other inland uses of the fuel. But the key point is that crude oil, as light as this, is as much a blending feedstock, as much a blending agent as anything else. So there is an opportunity, no matter which combination of solutions refiners choose, for light sweet oil from the U.S. to be used as a blending feedstock to produce lower sulfur fuels. So in conclusion, U.S. refiners can take a little bit more shale, not much, but some additional imports. Some imports we anticipate will be displaced. That trade flows in 2017 and since the lifting of the export ban have indicated that there's pretty substantial appetite for taking in U.S. crude. The IMO presents an opportunity, but an opportunity rife with risks in the sense that it depends very much on the compliance of individual shipping companies and how much lower sulfur fuel shippers will actually require. The OPEC plus cuts also pose a question mark, given the more oil that is held off the market, the more sour oil from the majority of OPEC countries that is kept off the market will make light oil more attractive, cheaper. So that is an opportunity for exporters from the U.S. But if the OPEC production deal comes to an end in 2018 or 2019, then those differentials between sweet and sour crude will start to rise again, disadvantaging sweet crude from the U.S. So I'll finish with this image of the global oil balance, that the global balance is still somewhat short light sweet crude. If you add condensate and light crude together, it still ends up being somewhat in deficit over the next couple of years. So the price incentives are mixed for refiners abroad when they're considering taking up U.S. crude. So I will leave it at that for now and hope to discuss this more with you.
Okay, thank you guys very much. Three very different but somewhat interrelated presentations when you look at things on a project-by-project basis or the development of the resource over time. I just wanted to start with a couple quick questions for each of you, but then I'm going to open it up to everybody so you can ask your questions as well. Rusty, you stopped your presentation with a picture of a truck. Would you like to say something else?
No, it was a picture of a truck.
It was a picture of a truck. So your picture of a truck, it seems like trucks are the answer to a lot of supply constraints or constraints on infrastructure these days. Are there enough trucks?
No, there's not enough trucks and there's not enough truck drivers. So both are an issue, and that's the reason there is a lot of folks trying to figure out how to build new pipelines in order to be able to resolve those problems. In the case of Canada right now, there's not enough pipeline capacity to get Canadian crude out of the country and into the United States, and so we're back to rail again. So it's all to whatever the next most expensive transportation alternative that there is. There's not nearly enough rail terminals in West Texas to take care of the problem, so you're stuck with trucks.
Maybe I lied. I have a second question for you. So can you talk for 1 second about the knock-on effects of the situation you're finding in the Permian with their takeaway capacity problems on other gas markets? I mean, how does this ripple through the rest of the country, or is it kind of isolated to the Permian?
As far as the dramatic effect on natural gas prices, that is isolated to the Permian, but it has an impact on everything else in the country. So basically, the way you look at the world is that all natural gas in the United States, all natural gas growth in the United States is trying to get to the only growth market in the United States, and that is the Gulf Coast. Either exports in the form of LNG or exports in the form of Canadian pipeline deliveries. There's some increase in gas-fired power generation, but it hardly moves the needle. So that means that everything that is being produced incrementally, both out of the Marcellus Utica, out of the Scoop Stack, out of the Permian, out of the Bakken, ultimately either has to get to the Gulf Coast directly, or it has to displace gas back into the Gulf Coast. That means that prices inside the Gulf Coast region, as soon as LNG exports kick in, are going to be at a premium. And everything else outside the Gulf Coast will be at a discount. And the more gas production there is that can get out into the market outside that Gulf Coast region, we call it the box, everything outside the box is going to be under pressure and going to have to suffer basis consequences until pipelines get built.
And Tisha, you know, one of the things that you often hear, unless you're one of those companies that's facing direct opposition of a project you're trying to execute on, is it's really hard to tell the difference between the kind of activism that's pesky and the kind of activism that's actually consequential. And so over the course of the things that you've been looking at quickly, do you have a sense of how much of this is just causing problems in terms of project execution, but doesn't actually either delay or lead to the non-completion of a project versus things actually delaying and or stopping projects from being executed?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that in a little bit of a roundabout way, which is things that we consider generally pesky are now becoming fundamentally challenging. And I'll give the two areas I think companies aren't focusing on where the biggest risks are coming. The one is this global conversation about zero carbon or 100% renewables. So this conversation is untethered from the reality of anticipated demand for fossil fuels and for energy growth around the world, but it is nonetheless deeply informing policy decisions globally and in the United States. And here we may not see it at the federal level, but it dramatically trickles to these local conversations where I'll go next. And it empowers an opposition to any form of development, which can mean anything from a truck, how you have trucking going through a community, to how you permit wells at locations unrelated to specific community conflict. So one thing I do recommend is that companies start thinking about this global conversation. They understand it as the macro influencer that it is, and they think about a strategy where when the world thinks about energy, they think about an old world that has fossils and a new world that doesn't, and companies developing a strategy that's bridging these. Not saying that companies aren't oil and natural gas companies, but that they're narrating in a future context. This trickles to locals where it's very difficult to discern concerned citizens from really active activists, and the key is to get to know, ultimately to get to know the players. So a very small but very influential group, particularly in wealthy areas, can delay a project 7 or 8 years through all the strings of delay tactics. So it is incumbent upon a company to get to know the stakeholders and then assess the relative risk.
Maybe one additional thing, but maybe focused to Rusty. Rusty, some of the things that Tisha talked about, a lot of people assume happen in Tisha's neck of the woods, right, but not yours. Do you see that situation changing?
Well, there were protests in the state of Texas. As a matter of fact, I live about 200 miles north of Houston, near the town of Longview, and some of the most fervent protests for Keystone XL a few years ago were in Longview, Texas. So, like Trish says, the world is changing, right? And so you just can't assume just because you're in the state of Texas, everything's going to be fine.
Okay, and last one for Amrit. One of the interesting things. So, if I summarize your presentation, it's essentially there's not really a market constraint for what the U.S. is producing, but we are in a period of time where refineries are looking at their options, both in terms of what they anticipate coming out of the United States, but then also what they think the impact of the OPEC Plus deal will be, and then also what some of these emerging regulations are. Do you anticipate any sort of changes in the way that the refining sector are thinking about, in a particular location, maybe particularly, thinking about their own refinery flexibility? You had it on a few of your slides up there. Or is this really just something in general downstream is absorbing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, refiners have faced kind of whiplash in terms of the incentives that they're dealing with over the last several years. Wide spreads between fuel oil and the other products have encouraged a lot of investment in the production of in the processing of these residual fuel oils, so that they can produce higher value products from it. But suddenly that fuel oil is going to be so inexpensive with the onset of the IMO that those investments don't really make sense anymore in that environment. So I think most refiners are playing a game of wait and see, that if 2020 is the deadline, so to speak, for the market impact of IMO to take hold, most refiners aren't investing with a view to 2020 right now. They're going to see how much compliance there is with these sulfur regulations, and after that we'll start to see we'll start to see investments in either just new crude distillation capacity that can take in lighter, sweeter oil, or if the incentive is there, potentially more investment in secondary units that can produce lower sulfur fuel oil. So the refineries have not really reacted yet to the newest wind, and I think we'll have to wait until 2021 or after to see how they do.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to all of you. Please wait for a microphone. State your name and affiliation and question in the form of a question. We'll do Tim and Herman and Howard, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, thanks very much for the presentations. I had a question for Tisha about when you see the sorts of outlooks that were presented in session 1 for 2018, 2019, and then into, what's your gut feeling when you look at those? I mean, do you feel that they've taken adequate account of the sort of constraints that you're mentioning? And a question on for Rusty on Mexico. Only 6% of that takeaway capacity is being used at the moment. Now, is that just a question of making the adequate infrastructure connections downstream, or is there some demand there that was anticipated but just is not showing up?
Sure. So, you're talking a few. Perfect.
Well, my question is actually rather similar in the sense that this morning everything was great and optimistic for the industry. Now this is like a cold shower. The last session. Those who already left, they didn't get the shower. But I wonder if there's any way one could quantify what this could do. And in that session, because it looks like that, both Rusty and Naresh, this technically can be solved over a period of maybe 5-7 years. But Trisha's, if anything, would get worse over time, because when you add more capacity, you get more water constraints. Over time, that those constraints would be worse. Is there any way you could possibly, any one of you, quantify it? Basically, is it going to potentially cut what we've been talking about, 5%, 10%, or more?
Thanks for the presentations. Howard Grunsbeck from MIT. I guess along similar lines, first of all, for Rusty, is there any opportunity, at least in the short term, for some kind of gas reinjection as a strategy? Just to shift it in time, let alone the kind of things that we're talking about this morning about enhanced recovery, but is there some use there that stops the gas price from running off to negative infinity? I guess on the last presentation, I guess it was a question of, are we seeing anything, I don't know what forward markets there are, and I know they get pretty thin, beyond, really the first year out. But do you see anything in terms of spreads between like light products and fuel oil, or anything that as opposed to, and I take your point that people are kind of playing, I guess, what might be called chicken in some, with respect to decisions about refinery investments. But do you see anything about spreads, future spreads and how they relate to past spreads that might tell you anything about what's going on and what people really think about the IMO? And I guess the other question's been asked for Tish, which is, do you think, what you have, how does that build into the numbers, so to speak, in terms of this? We experienced tremendous growth in 2017 production despite these concerns. And the question is, are the kind of forecasts people were looking at this morning, do they already reflect, in some sense, the effects of those concerns or not? Thank you all very much for very interesting presentations.
Okay, maybe we'll start with Tisha, and then we'll go to Rusty, and then Amrit.
Sure. So the slide that I haven't assimilated into my thinking this morning was the discount on the S&P, the discount of oil and gas companies. And I was certainly thinking about it in the context of this global conversation and a narrative that I'm exposed to a lot more frequently, where the world looks completely different and is caricatured in an old view that includes oil and gas and a new view that doesn't. Now, I am very, very bullish on the role of oil and gas in the context particularly of developing economies and the 1.3 billion people that are going to be raised to middle class levels. But that doesn't give us, I used to use that as an excuse not to look at this dominant global narrative, thinking the developing world was going to ultimately demand these resources, but I think that was naive, and I actually think that if we don't engage, if we don't participate in this narrative, if we stay in our room and they stay in their room, ultimately we're going to lose. So someone asked if there was a way to quantify this. I do see a spectrum. There's a do-nothing spectrum where essentially oil and gas gets perpetually just more difficult and more squeezed, and in developing economies, natural gas loses to coal because there's a split where renewables is getting paraded around and coal is developing quietly. But I'm a geologist, so if I quantified something, I would just be throwing my arms around. So we're going to spare you that problem. So ultimately, what I think that these conversations should include, and they are included, we're having them now, is the very real different perspective of a world without oil and gas. Like I said, I think it is untethered, but the two conversations aren't meeting, and that's something that we have to change.
So Tim, in terms of what's going on in Mexico, it's a combination of both. So the pipelines on the other side of the border are not there. They're being built, and they probably will be built sooner than the gas-fired power generation facilities that were also supposed to be there. Now, if you talk to the folks in the know, there was some sense that this was going to happen. We're going to overbuild the front end of this thing to make sure the capacity is going to be there for years to come, and that's true. Whether or not you would overbuild by 3 BCF a day, on the other hand, that sounds unlikely to me. And again, we don't see there's just no way that there can be more than a BCF or a BCF and a half in the next 3 years. So the problem exists there, and therefore the problem is coming quickly. So that kind of gets me to Howard's question of, can you put this gas back in the ground? Well, if you can't put it back in the shale, although Bob and I talked a little bit about the possibility of his idea that he mentioned earlier, but I think it's going to take a little infrastructure, and my guess is it's going to take a lot of compression to make that happen. So I don't think that's going to solve the problem if it happens like in September. And so yeah, so can we, are there conventional reservoirs in the Permian Basin that could be retrofitted for storage facilities? Absolutely there are. Of course, then once you put it in there, ultimately you've got to get it out someday, and you can't just build one of those things in about 6 months. Does that make any economic sense? Yeah, so the problem is it's too late. It does go negative infinity in our model, that's a fact. So there's just not enough time left for this cycle. Then you have to go to, well, all right, at least according to our projections, there's another pipeline that's going to be built, needed by 2021, 22. Surely they could do lots of storage alternatives to that if somebody wanted to go that direction. Or, hey, let's just build a pipeline down to the LNG export facilities and solve the problem once and for all. So why aren't the producers signing up? Well, there's a bit of a game of chicken going on, right? Because I don't want to sign up for that capacity. I want my friend down the street to sign up for that capacity, so I don't have to, so I get the benefit of basis improving without me being on the hook for the capacity to be able to move that gas. So there's a lot of waiting around going on right now, and if there's waiting around for pipelines to be built, my guess is they would be waiting around for storage facilities to be built too.
Briefly in answer to your question about spreads, we see spreads opening up pretty dramatically, spreads between high sulfur and low sulfur products, so fuel oil and diesel, for example, opening up pretty dramatically in 2020. enough to incentivize additional investment in coking, hydrocracking, hydrotreating, that those investments in 2021, 2022, once they take hold, those spreads will start to narrow again. But in the interim, we do anticipate some of the lightest oil could be blended directly into high sulfur fuel oil to produce compliant marine fuel. So the incentives are strong to invest in secondary processing capacity for a couple of years after 2020.
So we'll take another round. I do feel a little bit of pity, though, for Herman's cold shower experience this afternoon. If any of the panelists from the first two panels want to talk about how this is just rainy day boo-hooism, then we can do that. We have Susanna first, then you, then Roger.
Thank you so much for your comments and your insights to all the panelists. And I would like to thank Sarah, Frank, Guy, and Adam for putting together such a great program. My question is really for Tisha. I have two questions for you, sorry. My first question is, can you give us an example of a company that at a local level, when they were putting in some new infrastructure or something, just that did it right, that you just thought they just did it right? And walk us through that, and in terms of why you thought they did it right, how they got it right. My second question is probably illustrating my cynicism in all of this, but so in the last couple of years, from an investor and portfolio perspective, you had a lot of, you name it, endowments, pension funds, you name it, say, we're going to minimize our exposure to fossil fuels. And it's pretty easy to do in an environment where you've got a low price environment. You don't have performance in that sector. Now, in an environment where you do have performance, where you do have oil prices going up, or gas prices, whatever, you name it, whatever it is, do you think investors would be as willing to leave money on the table in a high performance environment? Like, how tied do you think they would be to this, I guess, this view? Thank you.
Tom Woods, first question is for Naresh. How much of the heavy crude that's going into the Gulf Coast is Mayan crude that's being shipped up from Mexico to be refined and then having the product shipped down? In other words, that is probably not going to go away. And the second thing is sort of like a little nick for you, Rusty. Which world would you rather have? Ever expanding surplus pipeline capacity and declining production, or growing production and the need to build more pipeline?
I won't answer that question.
Well, I had more of a comment, but this is the half glass empty panel, correct? Versus the half full. I think. I mean, I'm speaking for IHS, but I'm sure it's the same for you guys, that when we do these forecasts, we look at all the infrastructure. I mean, they're not devoid of infrastructure built up, and they might be quarters where you have real tightness. But I don't think that when you look at the system, saying that it's going to grow by 1 million barrels per day per year for the next 2 years or 3 years is an impossible task. It can do that. I think all the bottlenecks will be resolved with money and time. After all, I mean, we grew production by 5 million barrels per day. We redirected completely the whole pipeline system in the United States in the last 5 years. It's quite remarkable. So if you continue at the same pace, the bottlenecks will be pretty limited, actually, if you're growing at that 1 million barrels per day, which is probably the speed limit at this stage. But I don't think the speed limit is 500,000 barrels per day.
So an example of a company that did it right, they're not broadly applicable. I'll give one example. It's not broadly applicable, but the characteristics of a successful project do have two characteristics that I think can go broadly. One, they treat the community as completely unique. So you don't try to take something that worked here and take it over there, because every community ultimately demands its own negotiation regardless. And the second thing is they're willing to have whatever they came to the table with is change fundamentally. And that's really the difference. This isn't a negotiation where you walk in with your plan and offer this and then end up where you had there has to be something that gives and that changes. So the project I most recently saw that was very effective, the company went in, they had a 20-well pad proposed, it became super controversial in the community. Ultimately, they moved to a new location and donated the controversial location for a local community wildlife refuge and park. And it took a year of various engagements, but the community ended up supporting the new location. So that was an example, I think, where a company really demonstrated some vision and some flexibility to make that happen.
Just on the Maya question, I mean, most of the heavy imported crude in the U.S. Gulf Coast is either from Mexico, Venezuela, or Colombia. I don't know exactly what share comes from Mexico, but it is likely. I think that does happen. That has happened a lot over the last couple of years. That Mayan crude is imported and then sent back to Mexico as refined product. That's likely to happen less in 18 and 19, certainly, as some of the Mexican refineries like Salinas recover from some of their operational difficulties. There was flooding, power outages over the last couple of years that have crimped their ability to refine their own crude. So those volumes imported to the Gulf Coast are likely to fall over the next couple of years, but then stay pretty steady after that.
Going back to the comment about a few minutes ago about, yes, we all plan for capacity constraints on all the production forecasts that we do. And I'm sure everybody else does too. The issue, I think you said that, that money and time will take care of all problems. I would 100% agree with that statement. The problem is what happens in 4 months. So this is a short-term thing that we're talking about here. In the short term, the market can bite you. In the long term, the market's going to take care of itself.
My list. We had one second question from Susanna really quickly I wanted to address.
I'm glad you brought that up. I was just thinking about that. So it's my working hypothesis that the real impact of the divest movement isn't on the value of the things from which they divest. It's on the way it informs the conversation that then perhaps contributes to things like a discount in oil company stock. When there's more pressure, will there still be divest resolutions? Yes. Will the divest resolutions have impact on actual investments? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. I think it's the broad acceptance of the movement as a no-brainer that's the thing we should really be concerned about. So a university has a conversation about divesting, and the students and the faculty are writing letters supporting it, and they're not, the returns is not part of the conversation, but that conversation then informs the way the public is perceiving the rationality of being anti-fossil fuels. So that's the real pressure, and then we'll see if that pressure persists if more and more organizations start voting them down.
Just on the particular of your question, Susanna, though, whether that matters differently if prices are going up for fossil-based energy resources versus down, it is much more difficult to make decisions about divesting from something that's making you a lot of money, from something that's not actually making you a lot of money at a particular point in time. But I think if you look at some of the nuances of the ways in which people and institutions have made divestment decisions over a period of time, that's more of a sort of a cyclical and a timing thing rather than an overall trend thing. But I do generally agree with what Tisha was saying as well.
Yeah, just following on with a couple of observations. You might not know these examples, I'm sure you do, but just Norges Bank announced they would sell all their oil stocks, which is, well, they're the biggest fund manager in the world, I believe. They have $1 trillion under management. So I think it was at least $30 billion worth of stock that was going to be sold, which is in the process of being sold, actually. Rusty, you might be interested, I don't know if you know this example, but the National Balancing Point price went negative as a result of the interconnector. If I know you're a student of markets, Peter and I can't remember when it was, but I think it was the connection of the interconnector, and you had negative prices on that hub for some time, but exactly as you say, on a short-term basis. Rusty, can you comment on WCS differentials, which have been very notable? Thanks.
Yes, this is sort of a follow-up to Roger's question, and I think also it gets to what Howard was asking about earlier. We've talked about supply, we've talked about demand, we've talked about domestic refining, we've talked about exports. There's something we haven't talked about, and it is part of the solution to the very short term. It's called storage. And storage, of course, depends crucially on what the forward price outlook is. And we've seen a major change with the backwardation that's come in that affects the whole market. Now, obviously, you can build a tank very fast. Tisha's world notwithstanding, obviously there'd be lots of protests, but you could build it in Texas and nobody would care, right? So I'm just wondering whether inventories have a role to play that we've sort of missed out. Obviously, it has a big impact on psychology over the last few years. The surplus production every month found a home. A lot of that was in tanks. This happened in '99 as well. And the coming into the tanks and it's coming out of the tanks in an orderly fashion versus a disorderly fashion has a huge impact on the volatility of oil prices. So I'm just wondering, and maybe it's Rusty, maybe it's any of the others, maybe it's you, Sarah, do you think we've forgotten about something important in not discussing the role of inventories and how all this works? Because I think it's part of the adjustment process. Inventories build up. So your pipeline doesn't go to a refinery or a port, it goes to a tank. Those are shorter pipelines, easier to build. Then it comes out, but do you want to hold it or not depends on the forward curve, the price structure that we're looking at. So thank you.
Thanks, David. Rusty, you want to go first?
WCS, bad news, WCS. So production in Canada has continued to increase. It's been very difficult to build pipelines either in Canada to get to the coast or build pipelines here, as we know from Keystone XL. And so we had some mechanical issues the latter part of last year that basically flagged a lack of capacity across the border, that the issue was already there. It's just all of a sudden, then with the original version of Keystone, with the problems that they had, all of a sudden it was in everybody's face. We took a differential, which had been about $10 to about $25. That's about where it stayed since. And again, it's the same thing. It's a timing issue. It is unlikely that anything can get built to solve the problem within the next 18 months to 2 years. And that's assuming that the regulatory issues, both inside Canada and here at the state level, get resolved in order to get those pipelines built, or otherwise, it's rail. And that's the rail economics are what causes that $25 differential to be there. And it's going to be there for the next 2 years unless there's a, like 2 years ago, there's a fire, right? So it dropped production in Canada and the differential went away. But unless you've got some sort of situation like that, it's $25 for the next 2 years. And we're going to have a lot of rail flowing this direction again with all the issues that came along with that last time. It's just going to happen again. It's a real shame. In terms of storage, I guess I'd submit to you that storage worked pretty well. I mean, the market went into backwardation, and storage inventories at Cushing got sucked down. We've got a lot of inventory in Cushing, a lot of inventory capacity in Cushing right now. We built a lot of storage on the Gulf Coast. Everybody and their dogs built a terminal somewhere in the Houston Ship Channel down to Beaumont area, and they've all put a lot of storage in order to be able to accommodate exports out of the Gulf Coast area. So although we haven't talked about it, I think it's actually worked pretty good, and I think there's probably enough storage capacity to handle the market the way it's likely to evolve over the next few years.
Any other comments? Well, if there's no other questions, I think you guys have done a great job in sticking with us all day long. I will ask you in just a minute to help me thank this excellent panel that we've had, but because we're at the end of the day, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for spending so much time, and for all of our panelists, and on behalf of Frank and Adam and myself and Guy, And the whole team here, I just want to say a big thank you also to Ian Barlow and David and Akil and Andrew Stanley and everybody, and Lisa Hyland and Jane, who helped put a conference like this together. It's a really, it's a team effort and a labor of love, and we really do appreciate all of the insights everybody has shared with us today. We're going to continue doing a series of programming. We'll probably shift to the downstream here a little bit, looking at NGLs. There's this thing called the Renewable Fuel Standard that's making some news lately, so we'll be doing some work on that and some other issues as well. So we look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you, but please join me in thanking this panel and all the panels that came before it.